Hey guys, welcome back. We are diving into some more of the Chernobyl stuff. I've finished the mini series itself, the kind of a docu-series. There's discrepancies about what was truthful or known or honest about what was portrayed and what was unknown and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to talk about some of that. But I figured what I would do is go from scene by scene and talk about, not scene by scene on here, but just talking about the different things and trying to remember everything. I should have written it down as I was going along, but I've been watching reactors. I've been reading comments both on mine and on theirs and getting an idea of more accuracy for the show. I think that's the best way to describe it. In the first episode, we basically get the blast itself and stuff that happens after the blast and trying to piece everything together and kind of go from there. Before we got to that part, we actually had Lagasov. I'm still saying that wrong. I realize that. We had him recording tapes and then committing suicide. Okay, brought up the name so I can say it better. Legasov, Valery Legasov, the professor. So I've seen people say that the tapes were not actually what were done because if your place is bugged and they're listening and all that kind of stuff, why would you record tapes? And that makes a lot of sense. Somebody had said that he had written everything out, and that's what was distributed to all the scientists in the area and how the information got out there. So I thought, well, let's look and see if we can find that information. And as I'm looking for information, somebody posted that one of the Chernobyl firefighters, Ivan Chavray, died. This would have been 6 days ago from when I'm taping, so November 20th. And he died at age 64 due to COVID-19. One of three brothers who fought fires on the turbine hall roof and survived. Okay, so somebody asked, did he actually record audio tapes or was it made up for the show? And somebody responded yes and no. Yes, he recorded them. He recorded a lot of them actually because he used to use tape records as his working drafts. 5 of his cassette tapes were marked for Gubarev. And after the suicide, that Gubarev guy insisted on getting them from the KGB investigators. He had good connections in right places, so KGB redacted classified data on the tapes and passed them to Gubarev, who published them in the Pravda newspaper. Probably that tapes were raw material for Gubarev's book about Chernobyl, which was never written. And then the no part is, no, he didn't record tapes from the show. That Legasov tapes are pure fiction invented by Craig Mazin. So seems to be a little bit of confusion on that. So I don't know if I'll ever know the true story on that or not. It makes sense to me either way. My big question still is, how did whoever know where to find them? Which, if this guy's information is correct, then he expected the KGB to find the tapes because he knew they were watching him. But why hide them then? Why not just leave them out in the apartment? So I don't know. Still a lot of questions for me on that, so I'm not quite sure what the actual answer is. But that's one of the things that I found there was conflicting information on. One of the biggest themes that I saw in responses from folks, sorry, back's hurting already. Let me do this, sit back a little bit. There we go. All right, I'm comfortable. One of the things that seemed pretty consistent in a lot of comments that I saw was that the show villainized Dyatlov. What's his first name? Anatoly Dyatlov. Recognizing it. So this was something that with Tiger King that drove me nuts because I knew a lot about Big Cat Rescue before that show even aired. I'd been following them for years. And I knew immediately that the show was skewing things and not showing everything and not giving both sides of the story and all that kind of stuff. Going into Chernobyl and knowing that it's supposed to be kind of like a docu-series, but not really a documentary, but it's based on true events and all that kind of stuff, I knew that not everything would necessarily be the truth. So I appreciate the folks who did comment and say, just to clarify this and that and everything. And of course, some of it helps the story along. Of course, they do that with the movies that are based on real people, like John Elton's movie. I forget what it's called. John Elton said, we took some things out of place and put them somewhere else because it just fit better for the story. That's fine. Sometimes you've got to do that because it just doesn't work to try to do everything in chronological order and exactly as it happened and all that kind of stuff. Same thing with Rhapsody. Brian May and Roger Stone said, not all of this is exactly how it happened. There was stuff that was tweaked and added or subtracted just because it helped the movie along. So I expected that as well with Chernobyl. And that's exactly what happened with Ulana Khomyak. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I might not be. I'm probably butchering all of these. I'll go ahead and tell you that because I don't know any Russian. So I'll go ahead and apologize. But Ulana Khomyak was a fictional character based on many scientists, several scientists, and they showed the picture of the scientists at the end. So we saw that, and the series admitted that. Episode 2, we got to see some of where the powers that be kind of took over. There's a lot of discussion about how much of it was demand and how much of it was people just stepping up and all that kind of stuff. And there were some folks that pointed out this was USSR, not Russia. There is a difference, and there is. And when I was editing mine, I think I did keep that distinction in my stuff. I don't think I interchanged those terms at all. But the USSR definitely had its own reputation. It had even if it's not even okay. So like some of the command stuff that people were talking about, like the miners having to go in there, not really having a choice, or the not divers, but the 3 guys who went into the water to close the slush gate, something like that. The people that were drafted to be liquidators and that sort of thing. So there was a big discussion about how much of it was people being honorable and doing the honorable thing and how much of it was people being told they had to do this or had to do that. I didn't live in the USSR, so I don't know what it was really like. I admit that. And even if I did live in the USSR, just like in the United States, everybody's experience is different and how they interpret it and their experiences from before, how did it translate and all that kind of stuff. I can see both sides of it. I can see folks being voluntold to do stuff. We joke about that word all the time in our workplaces, but it's a situation. Had they just asked you, you might have volunteered anyhow. Voluntold, people might have done it anyhow if they had just been asked. People might not have done it unless they were told to do it. So my personal opinion, I think there's a little bit of both in what happened in the Soviet Union. I think as we give more information about what's going on and what people are told, they're more likely to volunteer if they're given the information and what the consequences are going to be and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't see a lot of people turning their backs and saying, not going to do it. Find somebody else to do it. So I can see both sides of it happening. Having to have 750,000 volunteers, give or take, to help with all the different things that had to be done, that's a lot of people. And so there was probably some voluntoling being done. Ludmila Ignatenko, I think is how the last name's pronounced. So one of the things that bothered me was what happened with her. And if I talk about too much about it, I'm going to start crying. So even if it was a fake situation, I'd still be crying because it's just. But Ludmila, as I watched people react and as I read comments and that sort of thing, I will say, as far as my comments about if they would have just have educated her about what her risks would have been. Now, granted, another common theme in the comments and stuff like that was people didn't know a lot about radiation at that time. But there were people that knew some of the possibilities, or at least knew to be more careful than not careful. Just saying the reason why we're wearing all this stuff is because we don't know what it's going to do to us. We don't know if we will get contaminated from their bodies and that kind of stuff. Because I've seen conflicting stuff about that as well, that once they got the clothes off the men themselves were no longer able to pass it on, but the clothes were, and stuff like that. And I don't know how much of that is true or not, because I'm not a radiation expert and I haven't studied it all that much. But in that unknown, at least say we're wearing all this because we don't know if we'll get it. And so if you're going to insist on being with him, put this on. Now, that being said, one thing I saw was that a lot of the nurses refused to help the men because they were scared of what they may get and that sort of thing. And so Ludmila, along with some of the other family members, were really godsends for the men, in that they were the ones taking care of them and making sure that they were getting what they needed and that sort of thing. And in the I don't know if it was a book or a documentary or what, but they kept the commenters were referencing Voices of Chernobyl. Ludmila is a contributor to that, and just talking about having to pull pieces of organ out of his throat, and they were defecating and stuff on themselves. And so if she hadn't have been there taking care of him, who would have been? If they had a shortage of nurses, and with a disaster that big, even if all of the nurses were agreeing to work, you'd still be shorthanded with all the care that was needed. So again, educate her about her risks, explain why it's important to know she's pregnant, put her in some protective gear at least if she insisted on staying to help him, and kind of go from there. And the other factor, which I don't know if I missed it when I was watching it, but somebody had said that because when she came out of the bathroom, I didn't realize she was in there with morning sickness. I just thought she was coming out of the bathroom because that's human nature. Some folks picked up on that being the clue that she was pregnant, and I don't know if that was the intention of the show. Also, apparently, she had just gotten married to her husband, Vasily. And so they had just gotten back from their honeymoon, according to what I'd seen. And so that was another reason for her wanting to be with him so badly. Newlyweds, wanting to be there for him, being pregnant with his child, all this kind of stuff added up. I still wish they would have educated what they did know and what they didn't know, what the risks were that they didn't know, and why they were wearing all the protective gear. And if she was insisting on staying, offering her some protective gear as well. I don't know if that would have made a difference, but that's what my line of thinking. One of the another common comment, that's harder to say than you think. was that the animal scene was in real life was worse than what they portrayed in the movie. And I read about some of that, and I'm glad they didn't show what the real stuff would have been, like some of the animals being buried alive and that kind of stuff because they ran out of bullets or stuff like that. The mutations, the animals eating each other because they had gone so long without any care and all that kind of stuff. Although that one scene, which I couldn't tell what was going on, I, I didn't think animal eating animal. I don't think I thought that while I was watching it. I thought somebody had died in their home and the animals were eating the person. But the more I watched reactors and stuff, I think it was another animal that they were eating, and that's why it was so gross and sick for him, and why the older the soldier, offered to finish that job. But I'm glad they didn't show us the worst of that, and as well as what they showed us of the humans was pretty bad. But I'm glad they didn't show us the organs, the organ pieces in the throat or the soiling themselves and that sort of thing. I mean, translucent skin that's necrotizing and that kind of stuff is bad enough. And to show us the worst, like the one guy had no face, and she made the comment, but they didn't show us that scene. Thank you. I thank the show for not showing us that. I think the other big thing was just the biggest thing that I got from the show was not only how tragic it was overall, but all of the misinformation and the lies. Some of it was outright lies, and then that continued a chain of misinformation. And that was probably the most frustrating part for me. And I get not wanting to look weak. I get not wanting to look weak. I also get that there are certain information that you don't want to get out. I've always said with the United States that we shouldn't know everything, because if we know some of our government secrets, then our enemies know. And so I think it's a fine line. You do need to be honest with what's going on. Like COVID-19, you need to say, this is a serious situation. These are ways that we're encouraging folks to protect themselves until we can find a solution, the vaccine being the solution. Trump admitted that he downplayed the virus because he didn't want people to panic. Well, people are going to panic when they find out you're lying to them. People are going to panic when they don't understand why all these people are dying when it's not supposed to be as bad as the flu, you know, this kind of stuff. So people are going to panic with Chernobyl when the radiation levels start going to other countries. Sweden and US found out, and that's the only reason, well, as far as we know, that's the only reason the USSR came forward. Germany wasn't allowing their kids to play outside because of the levels of radiation that were coming into the country. And yet they still hadn't evacuated some of the people that were right there around the area. They had done the immediate area, but not the wider area. So just things like that, the lies and misinformation that kind of caused a domino effect. They didn't tell the Germans they needed a robot that could handle 15,000 Rodigan, whatever that word is. They only told them 2,000. And what do you say? Thank you for sending us the robot that died because we didn't give you all the information that you needed. And then the fifth episode, I think the biggest thing I got out of that as far as clarifying information was that that specific trial did not happen. That was just something to help the story of the show, and to kind of sum everything up and put it in a nice, pretty bow for everybody. There was a trial because Dyatlov and I want to say Froman. That's not right. Dyatlov, Foman, And who was the other guy? The politician. Was that Toptonov? I don't know. I still have a hard time keeping all those names straight. At any rate, those three men were convicted, and so there was a trial. How much of that they actually deserved, of the consequences, I don't know. It seems like there was still proof of, at the very least, negligence on their part of things. Did they deserve 10 years hard labor? I don't know. I don't have all the facts. So, even with this, I don't have all the facts. So I don't know what to tell you on that. Also, I read that Sherbina Boris, and I still don't know if he's called Major, General, or, any of those things, because they just said Comrade Sherbina. I learned that he actually helped in recovery efforts of a major earthquake that they had. He was given recognition for that in helping people. I don't know if it was severe enough to need to save lives, but he helped people in that sense as well. And on Dyatlov, apparently he had been involved in a nuclear eruption, a smaller nuclear disaster in a previous job related to a submarine nuclear program. I don't remember exactly what that was. So I wanted to comment about that as well. So those were some of the things that I picked up watching other reactors and reading not only comments on mine, but comments on other people's information. So I just wanted to share that. And I'm also going to share I'm going to watch some clips from off of YouTube and see what they say about what's true and what's not. So we'll watch those together. I'll be splicing it up because I don't want it to be too long. Also, I had a question about that song, and I found the answer to that. So I'll actually go ahead and talk about that one. In the episode 4, I talked about the song that was being sung as they were burying the pets, and I wondered what it was. Found out that the song is called Black Raven in English. And I don't know if the group, at least the group on here that I found, I think the group is called Russian Folk. The featured artist is Dyatlov. So I thought that was a little ironic. I know it's not the same one. I found a translation of the song, and I thought I'd play just a little bit of the song for you. I don't know if I'm blocking myself. I probably am. But here is Black Raven.
Черный ворон, что ж ты вьешься над моею головой? Ты добычи не добьешься, черный ворон, я не твой.
I'm going to stop it there actually because I don't want to make this video too long, so I don't want to play all of it, but I'll put the link down below. Roughly translated, it's Raven Black, why are you wheeling? Why are you wheeling over me? Ever will your prey elude you? Raven Black, I am not yours. And what are you doing, spreading your wings wide over my head? Or do you sense prey beneath you? Raven Black, I am not yours. Fly you now off to my homeland, and say to my mother dear, say to her, my darling mother, that for fatherland I fell. Take my shawl, now stained with red blood, to my darling, dearly loved. Say to her that she is free now, to another I am wed. A smoldering arrow bound her to me upon the fated battlefield. Death, I see, is coming for me. Raven black, I'm now all yours. See, even reading stuff like that gets me a little bit clipped. We'll watch some other stuff together and see how it goes. Okay, got you guys on my lap now, but we're going to check out a video from Watch Mojo. This is their version of what the Chernobyl series got right and what they got wrong. We'll see what they have to say.
Number 10. The Pripyat evacuation was delayed. True. For creator Craig Mazin, the most shocking part of the Chernobyl disaster wasn't the explosion itself, but how the citizens of neighboring city Pripyat were kept in the dark.
What's fascinating to me is not that Chernobyl exploded, it's how close people were and how unaware they were, and how that night just unfolds in a way that I had no idea it unfolded and would have never predicted.
As depicted.
I agree with that, and that's what I've seen a lot of reactors reacting to is why aren't they getting these people out of there? And part of that is the chain of misinformation that happened, but also that wanting to look good and strong and not wanting to appear weak or different to other nations. I don't know how else to phrase that. You guys know what I mean.
The key players had mostly British accents. False.
I meant to comment on that. My first video, I made the comment that I kept expecting a Russian accent. And, I expected them to speak English, but with a Russian accent, and it was throwing me off and all that kind of stuff. But then I called myself a hypocrite because I watch other shows like Medici and Versailles and Reign. And all of those are in countries that are non-English speaking, but they have English actors without a French accent or a Italian accent or, that kind of stuff. So I was being hypocritical with that. And I take back my reaction for that if I can take it back. I don't know if I can, but I take it back.
The Chernobyl nuclear power plant and Pripyat are in northern Ukraine, but the characters of Chernobyl speak in English in the actors' own native accents. Craig Mazin made this creative decision early on in production, worrying that fake accents would start to sound comedic over time, like the Rocky and Bullwinkle show antagonists Boris and
I can
Natasha.
agree.
The showrunners experimented with the idea of having the actors try out Eastern European accents, but it turned the characters into caricatures. So, instead, the Soviet Union is suddenly populated with English speakers who have British, Swedish, and Irish accents. Mazin did choose against casting American actors, however, as he felt that would be too distracting. Number 8. Lyudmila Ignatenko story. True and false. Firefighter Vasily Ignatenko and his wife Lyudmila are two of the most tragic figures in the series. Although some details are tweaked, much of their story is all too true. In the show, Lyudmila pays off a hospital employee to see her dying husband and lies about being pregnant. That part really happened, but in real life, she also had to lie to the head radiologist about whether or not she already had children. Unlike in the show, the hospital staff strictly enforced the no-touching rule. Regardless, Mazin doesn't shy away from the fact that Lyudmila ultimately lost her husband and baby. Number 7. 3 volunteers went into Chernobyl's basement. True. The ending of episode 2 is like something out of a horror movie, as Alexei Onanenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov venture into Chernobyl's basement to drain water. This was done to prevent lava-like corium seeping into the water and causing a steam explosion that could have devastated much of Europe. It's difficult to say if Mikhail Gorbachev ordered the mission, and their big volunteering scene is largely romanticized. But Onanenko, Bespalov, and Baranov really did volunteer, knowing that the mission could be fatal. Fortunately, they survived. Baranov didn't die until 2005, while Onanenko and Bespalov are still living. Number 6. Miners were brought in to dig underneath. True. Although Chernobyl's basement was drained, it was still feared that the lava-like corium would burn through the concrete pad and contaminate the groundwater. To prevent this from happening, nearly 400 miners from nearby areas were enlisted to dig a tunnel underneath the pad to put in a heat exchanger. The miniseries depicted most of the miners stripping down to their birthday suits due to the heat. While accounts differ, a few indicate that some miners really did get completely naked. It's been reported that 1 out of every 4 miners at the site died from cancer or radiation poisoning brought on by Chernobyl. The real tragedy is that the corium never melted through the concrete pad, meaning the miners never had to dig.
So all of that effort
I didn't know that last part, so that's interesting.
and ultimately
Was unnecessary
because it never melted down to the
because
concrete pad.
it never melted through the concrete pad. So
Yeah.
But I lived Murphy's Law, and if they hadn't have had the miners do that, it would have happened, at least my experience.
never got to the groundwater.
Number 5, that helicopter crash. False.
Oh, I meant to mention that as well. I had read that it was actual footage that they used, and it was not the radiation that took the helicopter down, but the helicopter hit a cable. And yeah, if you watch the scene close enough, you can see the blade hit that cable that's dangling from the crane, and that's what takes the helicopter down.
In the episode Please Remain Calm, the Soviets try to tame the raging fire by dropping sand and boron from helicopters, which is true. Against Legasov's instructions, one of the helicopters flies directly over the core. Emerging from the cloud of smoke, the helicopter almost immediately crashes. Although there was a helicopter crash at Chernobyl, this didn't happen until October 1986. Almost.
So if you watch, you can't see where I'm pointing. Here we go. Here's my pointer. This helicopter blade, which is right around in here, is going to hit the cable right here. And that's what actually brings the helicopter down.
6 months after the explosion first took place. This crash reportedly occurred when the aircraft's rotors hit a crane cable, resulting in the deaths of the pilot and 3 additional souls. Even if the crash didn't play out like the miniseries depicted it, several pilots did lose their lives due to radiation exposure.
Now, I don't know if that is actual footage from the original helicopter falling, but.
Number 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. True. The tragic irony of the Chernobyl disaster is that it happened in the midst of a safety test at Reactor 4. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov really did ignore objections from plant workers Akimov and Toptunov. At 1:23 a.m. and 40 seconds, Akimov tried to perform an emergency shutdown, but the control rod seized. The first episode of this miniseries is entitled 1:23:45, deriving its name from the infamous timestamp of the subsequent explosion. Even though time was of the essence, the fire alarm wouldn't be activated until 1:26 a.m. and 3 seconds, which goes to show just how poorly the situation was handled. Number 3, Brukhanov and Fomin mishandled the disaster. True. While countless mistakes were made throughout the Chernobyl disaster, the miniseries singles out plant manager Viktor Brukhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin as 2 of the most reckless individuals responsible for the chaos. As seen in the first episode, this pair not only refused to accept that the core had exploded, but Fomin ordered Deputy Chief Operational Engineer Anatoly A. Sitnikov to check on the reactor. Sitnikov was exposed to a fatal amount of radiation as a result, but Brukhanov and Fomin continued to deny anything was wrong. The 2 were eventually arrested and found guilty for violating safety regulations that amounted to the disaster, receiving 10-year sentences each, along with Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. One aspect that is entirely fabricated, though, is the idea that a lone whistleblower uncovered the accident's cause. On the contrary, it was no secret among the investigating scientists that the RBMK reactor had problems.
In 1975.
Well, and they kind of indicated that because he knew about what was in that paper, so he was involved. So when they revealed that part, I wondered why he kept saying it's impossible for the RBMK reactor to explode when he was part of that research or had reviewed it or something. He knew of it.
Number 1, Valery Legasov's suicide. True. The miniseries doesn't get every detail about protagonist Valery Legasov down to a T. For example, Legasov is portrayed as a reactor expert, when in reality his specialty was radiochemistry. Nevertheless, one notable fact that Chernobyl got right was that Legasov committed suicide by hanging himself close to the 2-year anniversary of the reactor explosion. Granted, it's impossible to say if Legasov's suicide lined up with the exact minute the disaster took place, which the miniseries poetically suggests. Yet the way Legasov died is chillingly spot on. And Legasov really did record a series of tapes exposing new facts about the disaster, giving the world a better understanding of how it spiraled out of control.
Okay, so there was some new stuff in there. Got a little hair out of place. All the hair is out of place. I learned a couple of new things that I didn't know, providing that their research is accurate. Sometimes they don't always get it right, so I acknowledge that part. Let's see what else we find in here about. Aw, Fangs is taking a bath. So here is a video from Vanity Fair where they had a Chernobyl doctor fact check the Chernobyl series. So let's see what they have to say. And I moved to the thing, so hopefully I'm not blocking me now.
My name is Ala Shapira. I was one of the first medical responders after Chernobyl accident.
Wow.
I spent last 16 years working for the FDA to develop drugs against radiation exposure. Now I am going to review clips from Chernobyl HBO series. Okay, let's watch. This clip is very realistic. Approximately 2 months after the explosion, I spent a total of about 30 days examining patients who live in the most contaminated areas in Ukraine. We were told very strictly not to tell the population that anything is wrong. Our job was to tell them that everything is good, and if we say opposite, then we will lose our jobs and we would never get them back.
Wow.
In this clip, a worker from the nuclear power station starts bleeding shortly after the explosion. This scene is not realistic. Radiation will lead to bleeding if patient developed acute radiation syndrome with a bone marrow failure, but this would occur in the first weeks, never on the spot.
Okay, good to know, because they showed us several times where the bleeding and everything seemed to be right away.
People were told that they are leaving only for 3 days, but they never came back. Not all the buses came on time. Children and adults were all outside their houses waiting for the buses. They were playing in the radioactive sand, and the showers of radioactive particles were falling on the ground. I've heard this story from one of the mothers whose child I treated 2 years after evacuation from leukemia.
And, with the kid being out in the particles and everything, that just kind of backs up what some commenters were saying. I think there was two different commenters from Germany that were talking about being kids and not being allowed to play outside and everything, yet they hadn't evacuated the people that were there near the site.
Potassium iodide will protect from thyroid cancer only if it's given in the right time. It's not clear how soon after the exposure Uliana offered the secretary to take iodine. The maximum amount of time potassium iodide would be effective is about 12 to 18 hours after the exposure. The Soviet government started handling potassium iodide to children 10 days after the explosion, and at that point it was a totally useless effort.
That's another thing too, trying to keep people from panicking and all that kind of stuff actually makes things worse. If they had known sooner, they could have taken the tablet sooner, and maybe it might have prevented some future issues.
People went to the pharmacy where potassium iodine was over the counter, and not knowing the dose, they just fed their children with the pills. If the dose or regimen is exceeded the normal, it causes acute ulcers in the stomach. In Kiev, I was called to the emergency room where parents brought children bleeding from their stomach due to incorrect dose of potassium iodide.
See, that's terrible too. When people don't seek advice first and that sort of thing. And you can ask your doctor in the US, you can ask a pharmacist, and they can advise certain things, risks, that kind of stuff. With COVID, we had people that were trying to take the one medication that scientists kept saying it does not protect you, and this kind of stuff, but people were taking it anyway. And then you had the whole incident with blurting out recommendations that would kill people. And you guys know what I'm talking about. And it's like, even though it seems like common sense not to do some of that stuff, there are people who will do it if it's suggested to them. And so that's the terrible thing also. So, it's a fine line. You don't want them to panic. You want them to have the information. You want them to know risk factors and protective factors and all that kind of stuff. But you also don't want to encourage them to do any unhealthy things either.
Lead is one of the most used metals that protect from radiation, and using this local armor would help to protect local area. Animals were highly contaminated and nobody took care of them to wash them off, so there was a fear that they will spread the radiation around. This is how Soviet government thought: less knowledge, more silence, and less panic. My boss asked me to collect information about radiation to make a presentation in front of medical personnel at the largest hospital in Kiev, just to give them the basic ideas about radiation and what to expect, how to treat patients. Nobody had any training in radiation, neither at the medical school nor during our careers. I
Wow.
entered the National Medical Library in Kiev and stared in disbelief on the empty shelves with no books. I asked the librarian to provide me some books or journals about radiation, and the answer was they received an order from the above to take all the books and journals from the shelves that contain a word radiation.
That's just crazy. Crazy how much information was censored.
People with acute radiation sickness, they are not radioactive, they are not contagious to adults, to pregnant women, or to children.
That's good to know.
The firefighter did not wear his contaminated clothes and was showered. After these two, he would not be contagious or dangerous to anybody who is around him.
But would they know that at that time, since there wasn't a lot of information about radiation? Did the staff know that?
These false beliefs had a very dangerous outcome. Many children were evacuated to Moscow, and many families in Moscow who were offered to host these children, they rejected because they claim that these children are contaminated, or they call them dirty and they don't want them in their household. I don't think that this is a realistic to have all this degree of burns and coloring and intensity all over the body. I did not work at the burn clinic. However, my colleagues who did work in Moscow in hospital number 6 provided me with pictures of radiation burns, and I never seen anything like portrayed in this. These look like someone really, a painter or artist was doing this without any solid knowledge or experience.
So that makes me wonder, because now we've got a conflict of information on that, because everybody else was saying it was much worse than what we were seeing. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I did hear, I don't know what she's getting ready to say, but I heard that that statement Ulana makes is probably accurate to what the doctors believed at that time, but that's not necessarily true of what she said.
Medical fiction that fetus can absorb radiation. There is no science behind it. It's not like my opinion. I would say there is no science behind saying very inaccurate thing that fetus would absorb the radiation and die, but protect his mother. But viewers who were watching this clip, they believed. My colleagues called me asking if this is true because it was so not convincing, but it was there. It was emotional and dramatic, and that's what people felt. It was ironic to me that next statement that came from Uliana was, we need to tell the truth. This is a postscript to the series. The number of 93,000 is largely inflated. It's difficult to make a direct comparison between rates of cancer before and after Chernobyl. The diagnosis is much better. People are undergoing screening, which was not a case before. So in order to have correct numbers, statistically significant, the large epidemiological studies needs to be done and properly assessed.
That makes sense.
It's matter to get the medical facts correct. We cannot undo the past, but we can learn from the past. And if
Agreed.
it's ever a nuclear accident, our response to people from contaminated areas should be based on science, not on fear.
Agree with that as well. So that was interesting information that she was giving as well. Okay, the video we're going to review now was sent to me in my comments, and it's called Chernobyl Uncensored Documentary. This is from 2013, and the person who posted is posting in Dutch. Do I still have the translation? I don't have the translation anymore. But at any rate, I'm not sure exactly what this is about. The comments below it are very supportive of it from what I've read. I didn't get into any negative ones. It's an hour and 32, almost 33 minutes long. So I've got my popcorn. Let's see what they have to say. So is this actual footage? No, this is recreated.
By that night, 28 more will follow in the next few months.
Hmm.
They are the first victims of Chernobyl. This is the true story of the Battle of Chernobyl.
Okay.
He is the first journalist to witness the gaping hole.
Wow.
When we flew over the block, I opened the window of the helicopter. I didn't realize then what a big mistake that was.
Mm-hmm.
Like in a tomb, a real dead silence. I couldn't even hear the helicopter anymore. Nothing. A black
Wow.
hole.
The consequences of such false information were particularly dramatic.
Yeah.
Normal atmospheric level is about 12 millionths of a Rontgen. In Pripyat, by early afternoon, readings are already over 200 thousandths of a Rontgen. In other words, 15,000 times higher than usual.
Wow.
And that night, 7 Rontgens. My subordinates were starting to wonder if the machines were working properly, or was someone lying to us. We did not know
Somebody's
that the
lying
reactor
to you.
was still burning and radiation was still spreading. This map is sealed in plastic because it's still radioactive.
Wow.
One old man didn't want to go. He stayed behind. They found his body a few weeks later.
Mm.
People didn't really.
Yeah, it's kind of like the hurricane evacuations. Sometimes the people won't leave for various reasons, and sometimes they survive, sometimes they don't. Hello.
Believe what was happening. They thought they were being lied to. They remembered the German occupation and said that in 1941 there were bombs that fell. But now there was nothing. The elderly people didn't believe in an invisible enemy, and there was no time to explain. My soul.
So that's probably the role that that old lady in the 4th episode was portraying, is exactly what he's describing right now. And is this guy the one that in the series was the major colonel, sergeant, whatever level, that said that he would go in the lead-lined truck and get the reading so that his men weren't exposed? I think this is the same guy. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you'll correct me anyhow.
An accident of this scope. They even thought the reactor would be back in service by May or June.
Are you kidding me?
Because of the fire, the temperature at that height was between 120 to 180 degrees Celsius. Our dosimeter, the
That
instrument
is
for
hot.
measuring
The radiation level above the reactor is over 3,500 rongens, almost
Wow.
9 times the lethal dose. Some of the pilots make up to 33 flights in a single day.
Each time they went, they received 5 or 6 rongens. If they were slow, it was even more. After a while, they'd start throwing up.
Gosh. That's just, I can't imagine.
It has the country's only service, which specializes in acute radiation sickness and illnesses linked to massive doses of radiation exposure.
Okay. So that makes sense on why everybody was shipped to there.
It's only later that much more fatal symptoms appear, such as
Mm.
deterioration of bone marrow and horrible burns that eat flesh down to the bone.
Okay, so those pictures do kind of contradict what the doctor who was reviewing for Vanity Fair, what she was saying. So I wonder how the firefighters died within 2 weeks. So the skin and everything starts to dissolve, for a lack of a better word, within 2 weeks. I wonder once that process starts how fast it is.
They arrived during the latency period. They felt fine.
Okay, so the latency period is when it looks like they're getting better, but really not.
The forest has been scorched by the radioactive blast from the explosion. But the disaster area already stretches well beyond. Since the explosion, radioactive particles carried by the clouds have been falling with the rain.
Those trees are just all dead.
I was there and I witnessed it. The parade of death.
You know, I know it's not the same thing as COVID, but we have similar stuff going on with people being encouraged to go ahead and go to church. It's okay. Go ahead and have your Thanksgiving. Go ahead and live life normally during COVID-19. And it's like, no, you don't understand. That's making the issue worse. And so that's kind of the same thing when they're encouraging them to celebrate May Day and all that kind of stuff. It's putting them more at risk. And just frustrating.
Footage of May Day 1986 has now disappeared from the Ukrainian National Archives. All that remains are Igor Kostyn's photos.
And the internet didn't live then.
Secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party later committed suicide.
Through you. It gets into you, and you only start feeling the effects later. Sometimes years later.
Delayed reaction.
The reactor.
When we started dumping lead in, the temperature went down right away. It absorbed well and sealed the hole as it melted, so there was less radiation.
Okay.
But some of this lead melts when it hits the blaze and vaporizes into the atmosphere. 20 years later, traces of it can be found in the sick children of Chernobyl.
Lead poisoning. Wonderful.
A delegation of technicians from the Kirchhoff Institute venture into the labyrinth.
And they didn't show this part.
The white-hot magma has cracked the cement slab and seeped into the empty basin. It is now threatening to sink even further.
So it did go through the concrete slab. So that one video we watched was wrong.
Lies a huge stretch aquifer that supplies the entire country with water.
Oh, okay. So maybe that video wasn't wrong because it hasn't gone through that one layer.
In 1 month, 10,000 miners from Russia and the mining regions of the Ukraine are sent
10,000?
We drank water out of open bottles, which was really bad because the radioactive particles were ingested right into our body.
Yeah.
Radioactivity at the mouth of the tunnel is 300 times higher.
We did our duty. Shouldn't we have done it? It's too late to judge. I don't regret anything.
So that kind of what we're hearing throughout this documentary is kind of they're told they need to. They had a visit from the Kremlin. They said, we need you guys to do this. So they're kind of voluntold, but at the same time, they have this duty of, yeah, I've got to do it because somebody has to.
That a fourth of these men died before the age of 40. 2,500 lives lost that don't appear in any official statistics.
So that is a lot different from 400 that they show us in the series. What did they say in this one? 20,000 men? I think they said 20,000 men. I forget now. Whatever it was in the thousands. And that is much different than 400.
National conference that will be held in Vienna, where the Soviets have agreed to share all their data on the disaster.
But they don't.
Helicopters drop tons of a sticky liquid dubbed Berber, a mixture that coagulates and plasters the radioactive dust to the ground.
And then they've got to scrape it up.
One by one and buried. At night, the trucks, the machines, and the...
Could you imagine, you know, we've got folks around here that have homes that their fathers built or grandfathers built. Could you imagine having to leave that home and then that home getting destroyed?
They absolutely have to be gotten rid of before construction continues.
There's the actual footage they were using.
Their electronic circuitry can't hold up. They go berserk and break down. One of them hurtles itself into the breach.
Wow. I would start at the railing and clear it as
General Tarakanov's calculations,
you get out.
The level of radioactivity, estimated to be 7,000 rongens per hour, only allows the bio-robots 45 seconds on the roof. Only enough time for a couple
Oh, that's
of
different from the 90 seconds. That's half the time. Even more reason to start closer. I know I'm talking over everything. That's another reason to start closer to the railing, because if you can clear out close to the railing as you're getting the rest of the stuff as it comes further away, you're not tripping over it going back and forth, which takes longer. You'd be more efficient if you cleared the spot in front of the railing and then worked your way out. Does that make sense?
Reactors 1, 2, and 3 are back up and running. The first battle of Chernobyl has ended in a victory that heralded the
So
end
they
of
think
the
that'll last
USSR.
about 30 years,
But
which
for
is why
many,
they've got that
it
big
also marks
dome.
We've all got a bunch of symptoms. Heart,
See,
stomach,
muscle
liver.
waste.
And the authorities appear to be ignoring their plight by cutting down their welfare money.
And to compare it to COVID again, you know, we've got folks who haven't been able to work or have limited work and or have been sick or having to take care of sick family from COVID. And Congress has only approved one stimulus package and have not approved another one. They didn't get it done before the election. They didn't get it done before Thanksgiving. Who knows when we'll get another stimulus bill for people. Luckily, I'm not hurting for one, but a lot of people are.
Only 59 deaths have been officially attributed to the Chernobyl disaster.
Oh, 59.
Not a single statistic on the state of the
Oh,
500,000
it's 31, the
liquidators.
series said.
No
So
figures
50
on the population that
plus
continues to live
is
around Chernobyl and in the
more.
contaminated.
The most dangerous element that came out of the Chernobyl reactor wasn't cesium or plutonium, but lies. The lie of 86.
Totally agree.
Issue raised in 1986 by the Soviet delegation at the Vienna conference has been systematically ignored. And yet, the result? Entire litters of deformed animals.
That's so sad.
There's been no official study of genetic mutations stemming from Chernobyl. Yet despite the thousands of miscarriages and abortions that took place
It's
following the disaster,
encephalopathy, or
there seems to be
it's the
hundreds
opposite of
of
whatever
children who suffer the effects
encephalopathy
of
is.
radiation. They also organize therapeutic camps aiming to teach the new generations in contaminated areas how to live with radioactivity.
I didn't know that about Gorbachev.
And these were the missiles we'd intended for the Americans. 2,700. Imagine the destruction.
It's crazy.
To cover the first sarcophagus, it will cost $1 billion. An international fund led by Hans
So that's
Blix
the
has been
dome
set
that
up.
we've seen in the other footage, and it actually cost $2 billion.
The time it takes for half of the plutonium to disappear is 245,000 years.
True. So learned some things in that. The video that we saw with the doctor from Chernobyl makes me wonder if she felt a certain amount of pressure to make them look better, because some of the information that she said contradicted what was in this video. This video had documentation footage to back it up, so I tend to believe it more. But when you're interviewing the people that were involved with it, how much truth are you getting out of them? So that's the other side of it. Do you take this documentary at face value, or do you accept that there's probably some information that is not accurate or not even shared? I don't know, but it was an interesting documentary. So we have another video. This one is done by Insider, and it's a short one, about 7 minutes, entitled 12 Ways HBO Changed the Chernobyl Story. I imagine it's going to give us some information we already knew, and let's see if it gives us any new information.
In Chernobyl, an elderly Bolshevik by the name of Zarkov is fictional. His speech urging officials not to raise alarm about the accident, that's also a fabrication.
Although that seems to be what happened.
If all of the melting corium hit groundwater. But when corium starts melting, it does so in a very uneven way. So if the second explosion had actually occurred, it'd be pretty difficult to predict the fallout.
Sounds like a lot of it was hard to predict. There was some interesting stuff in that. I think that's going to be it for my deep dive into Chernobyl. Going to move on to some other projects and go from there. If you want to leave any further comments or information or anything like that down below, feel free to do that. I will talk to you guys later. Have a good night.